I'm Cathy Sharp. I'm the Director of Research for Real, which is a social research and evaluation consultancy based in Edinburgh. I've been a researcher for over 20 years. The Homelessness Prevention Innovation Fund was a fund that was established in 2005 by the Scottish Government. They gave money to 8 projects to undertake innovative practice around homelessness prevention. The Homeless Prevention Innovation Fund was part of a package of measures that was announced as part of the Statement on the Abolition of Priority Need to the Scottish Parliament in December 2005. The fund provided £230,000 divided between 8 projects for them to try out new ways of working around homelessness prevention. I worked with Lucy Robertson, and together we provided evaluation support for the 8 projects. The aims of the evaluation were really threefold. The first was to support local projects to undertake their own evaluations of their particular work. The second was to bring the projects together and to look across the projects to provide national level learning about homelessness prevention. And the third was to provide lessons really for evaluation practice. We looked at 8 organisations. They were very varied, but I think what they all shared was that they're really what we would call precautionary. Mostly they were not dealing with people who had an imminent crisis of homelessness. Largely they were about the longer term, and they were about supporting resilience, if you like, building people's networks and confidence in order to be able to withstand a future crisis. The plan was that we would use an action research approach for this evaluation. That would involve the projects almost evaluating themselves as they went along and implementing their learning into practice as they went along. Our role would then have been to provide, if you like, mentoring support to them in that role and to perhaps offer criticism where that was required. One of the lessons that we learned about an action research approach is that if it is to work effectively, it has to be signalled very clearly from the start by the funders and commissioners. What happens in practice, and for a lot of really valid reasons, is that projects have a particular idea about what it means to evaluate, and that's not always a very positive one. Evaluation is often experienced as a kind of audit process rather than a learning process. And I think if funders want that to be different, they have to say that very, very clearly and provide support so that projects can really understand what that means as they go along. What happened in practice was that some of the projects said, OK, we'll put our own arrangements for evaluation in place. That means we tick that box. Some projects didn't really think about it very much at all. And to be honest, there was a certain resistance to the whole idea of evaluation. Not surprisingly, the kind of people that work in these projects are much more interested in getting on with the job, which is about providing a service to people who are potentially homeless. And obviously, that's very important. We provided a bespoke service really to the projects, which meant we worked out what we thought we could most help with and did that. In some cases, that meant that we helped them to identify their outcomes rather than their outputs. In other cases, it meant that we interviewed some of their service users to provide some evidence really of their perspective and whether the project was working from their point of view. We did some writing and we did other kinds of support along the way. There are lots of challenges for the monitoring and evaluation of homelessness prevention. A really important one is that we really struggle to prove that the interventions that we make, the schemes and the services and the projects that we implement actually prevent homelessness. Now, some of that is down to how you measure the prevention of homelessness. And if you measure it, which is a common thing to do in terms of reductions in homelessness presentations to local authorities, actually you might find that you've increased that measure. Some of the projects, for example, that are concerned with domestic violence might give women experiencing domestic violence more information, and they might be more likely to then apply as homeless to a local authority. Monitoring and evaluation needs to stop being a specialist subject for social researchers. It needs to become a concern of senior managers concerned with the delivery of policy and practice in homelessness. We suggest a different way of thinking about evaluation and the use of evidence, and have proposed a sort of three-pronged model of that, which we think should encourage better use of evaluation evidence in designing new interventions and programmes, and also encourage the generation of new evidence as those programmes are implemented. So you might draw on existing evidence from previous evaluations and ideas about what works, but not assuming that everything that works in one context will automatically work in another context or with a different group of people. One example of that we came across in the research is a fairly common assumption that what might work with homeless men would work with homeless women. Well, one of this important lessons is to value evaluation and to embed it into projects and programmes from the very beginning, and to provide appropriate support and resources so that it can actually happen. But there are some other lessons that are more about the detail, perhaps, of the evaluation. One is that it's really important to measure outcomes rather than outputs, or at least to focus on outcomes. And we provide in the Good Practice Guidance some ideas about how to do that. One of the things that we suggest is that it would be very useful for there to be a requirement from funders and commissioners of services for projects to actually spell out how they think that the activities they undertake lead to the outcomes that they seek. And to do this in quite a detailed way, to break it down into the steps that they expect to happen. Evaluators call this a theory of change model, or you might call it a storyboarding approach. And this is very useful, but it's very difficult to do, if you like, after the event. It's much better to do it as part of designing the programme and planning the programme. So that is actually an important lesson for evaluation, but it's really about how you design the programme in the first instance. We would want to stress that it's still important to evaluate, even if it's a small-scale project or intervention. It's important that you learn about what's effective for you, and it's also important that you disseminate that knowledge so that others can learn from it. But obviously it's important as well that you build in the time and the resources to undertake that evaluation and value that process. Anyone who wants to learn more about this evaluation should go to the Scottish Government website.